Hello and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. First off, a thank you to all the recent patrons we've had. The best of general thanks to Nuno Alpalhau. Hope I've got reasonably close with the pronunciation there, Nuno. Lieutenant General thanks to James Maloney, Barry Blaine and G.S. Culser. And Major General thanks to Maxime Beaupré, Roy Nodler, Kyle Beach, David Tippy and Glenn Gardner. Thanks to you all. Now, if you're wondering what all that is about, from next season onwards, Angus and I wanted to run the podcast with the help of tip pledges from patrons each time we release a new episode. You can find out all about this at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/The History Network. But essentially the podcast has never made us any money, and we're certainly not looking for it to give us the life of luxury now either, but we've been doing it for 12 years, and a lot has changed for both of us in that time. New homes, new countries even, and new families. I've just recently had my first child, and as a result it's become more difficult to find the time each month to pump out a couple of episodes a month. So that we can dedicate some time to it, and also so that we can pay our contributors, some of whom have been regular listeners over those 12 years as well, who write for us, something we've never been able to do before, we're looking to get tip pledges totaling $350 per episode. But all you have to do as an individual listener is just pledge a few tens of cents per episode. That is all. There's enough of you listeners out there that just a small pledge like that would see us hit the target easily. At time of recording this intro to the last podcast of season 25, we are about halfway there, so still some way to go. We will probably kick off season 26 anyway, even if we don't hit the target, and we'll see how it goes. But if you can find it in you to pop along to patreon.com/The History Network and pledge just a small tip, that would be great. Nothing will be taken from you until and if we release that first episode of season 26. The great thing about Patreon is that your tip pledge is never taken unless we release a new episode. You can set monthly limits and you can amend your pledge at any time, so you are always in control of it. Thanks for listening to all that. Thanks for your patronage over the last 12 years if you've been with us since the beginning, and welcome and thank you if you are newer to us than that. Both Angus and myself hope you'll continue to enjoy the historynetwork.org podcast. The historynetwork.org podcast, season 25, episode 10, The Battle of Marston Moor. On Sunday, the 22nd of August, 1642, Charles I of England unfurled his standard at Nottingham. It would signal the start of the English Civil War, a struggle which pitted regal power against Parliament. The war had ebbed and flowed for 2 years with varied success when in April of 1644 a Parliamentarian force laid siege to York, which was considered key to the Royalist defence of the north of England. When an army was dispatched under the young Prince Rupert to raise the siege, the scene would be set for one of the bloodiest battles fought on British soil when the two sides met at Marston Moor. York was ably garrisoned within the medieval walls, and for a while Royalist cavalry was able to keep open a bridge over the Ouse. The result was that the city could only be invested from two sides. The Parliamentarian commanders, Lord Fairfax and the Scots Earl of Leven, needed more men, who duly arrived with the Earl of Manchester. With York now completely cut off, Charles had to act or accept the loss of the city. It was decided that the young Prince Rupert would lead the relief force. Rupert was the son of the German Prince Frederick V, whose wife was the eldest daughter of James VI of Scotland. This made Rupert a nephew of the English King Charles. Born at the start of the 30 Years' War, he began soldiering early. At the age of 14, he attended the Dutch pas d'armes with the Protestant Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange. Later that year, he fought alongside him and the Duke of Brunswick at the Anglo-German siege of Rheinberg, and by 1635 he was acting as a military lifeguard to Prince Frederick. Rupert went on to fight against Imperial Spain in the successful campaign around Breda in 1637 during the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands. By the end of this period, Rupert had acquired a reputation for fearlessness in battle, high spirits, and considerable industry. When he arrived in England, the king appointed him General of Horse, an important position which kept him close to the king's council. Rupert set off up the north-west of England. The intention was to gather Royalist troops to him, securing Lancashire before crossing the Pennines to relieve York. Bolton was stormed and Liverpool fell after a siege, but the city of Manchester still held out when Rupert received word from the king. The dispatch was ambiguous as to Charles's intentions. His capital at Oxford was under threat, but it was not clear if Rupert was to raise the siege at York and return to bolster the king's forces, or if he was to attack the Parliamentary army after relieving York, so securing the north of England for the king. By June 1644, York was completely cut off and starting to starve, but for those Parliamentarians outside, their situation was a little better, as the countryside for miles around had been ruthlessly foraged. So, at the end of June, it came as a surprise to them when word came that a Royalist force of some 10,000 horse and 8,000 foot, led by Prince Rupert, was fast approaching. Rupert had decided that the wisest course of action was to both relieve York and defeat the Parliamentarian army before marching south to aid the king. The problem that the Parliamentarian commanders, Fairfax, Leven and Manchester, had was their forces were divided by the rivers surrounding York. This could allow Rupert to attack each force one at a time, destroying them in detail. They decided to carry on the siege for 2 more days in the hope of further reinforcements arriving. When word came that these reinforcements would not be there in time, they decided to abandon the siege, withdrawing to a moor close by Long Marston. On the evening of Sunday, 30th of June, word came that Rupert had hurried his men forward, and they were quartered at Boroughbridge, some 20 miles away. The Earl of Manchester's chaplain wrote of hearing the news, "Nay, their Goliath himself is advancing with men not to be numbered, bloodhounds attending them, all more ravenous than wolves, fiercer than tigers, thirsting for blood, but our eyes are towards heaven, from whence cometh our help, and we will pray and wait upon the God of our salvation and mercies." In anticipation of a battle, the few remaining Parliamentarian troops were withdrawn from York, and the siege was raised the following day. Rather than ride into York to greet the Marquess of Newcastle, Rupert sent a deputation requesting he send out the men under his command to join him, so the combined force could attack the retreating Parliamentarians. At this point it is perhaps worth noting Rupert was in his mid-20s. Whilst of a quick intellect and undoubtedly fearless, he lacked the self-awareness and diplomacy that would come later in life when dealing with others. But not riding into York personally, he had slighted the Marquess of Newcastle, a much older man at 54, and one who had sacrificed much in support of the king. Newcastle urged Rupert to avoid a pitched battle. He was in favour of playing for time, as further reinforcements were expected. He also believed the current alliance of the Scots under the Earl of Leven and the Parliamentarians to be fractious and could not last long. The result was that Newcastle tarried in York. Meanwhile, the first of the Parliamentarian forces began to withdraw from Marston Moor early on the morning of 2nd of July 1644 as the infantry withdrew south, while the English under Fairfax and Manchester had been keen to engage Rupert before he could be reinforced. The Earl of Leven had favoured withdrawal to gain a more favourable position. As the bulk of the forces were made up of the Scottish Covenanters, it was Leven's position that prevailed. With the bulk of the infantry already on the move, and the cavalry, including Oliver Cromwell and his Ironsides, acting as a rear guard at Marston Moor, it came as a surprise when at 9 a.m. a body of Royalist horse rode on to the moor, pulled up to face the Parliamentarian cavalry, and then withdrew at speed. Rupert had got word of the intended Parliamentarian withdrawal and had hurried his men overnight. By 11 a.m. some 5,000 horse and dragoons had arrived at Marston Moor, with more arriving all the time. Seeing Rupert's men arriving in large numbers caused alarm with Fairfax. He was perfectly aware, with the Parliamentarian force strung out as they withdrew, an attack on their rear now could not be withheld, and a rout would ensue. The order was given to recall all the troops to Marston Moor to face the threat. Had Rupert attacked straight away, Fairfax's fears may have come true, but Rupert tarried. The intransigence of Newcastle to dispatch his men with haste from York had denuded the Royalists of a numerical advantage, forcing Rupert to ride the 7 miles to York to urge Newcastle and his men to join them at Marston Moor. It would have been late afternoon before Rupert returned with the troops from York and the Marquess of Newcastle. Throughout the day the two sides had formed up. The Vale of York is predominantly flat, but on this terrain the 30-metre rise of Marston Hill was a prominent feature and occupied by the Parliamentarians. A few hundred metres in front of the hill ran a long drainage ditch, which to the west fed into a stream. This ditch separated the two sides deployed to the north and south of it. Whilst its defensive capabilities have subsequently been disputed, there seems little doubt that it created an obstacle of varying effectiveness. Throughout the day, both sides drew up, with the ditch between them. At some point in the afternoon, an ineffective artillery duel took place, and at around 4 p.m. Prince Rupert arrived back from York with the garrison in tow. The weather had turned grey, and showers had dampened the offensive spirits of a number of Royalist commanders, who now considered that it was too late in the day to go on the offensive. So sure that the action would be the following day, the Marquess of Newcastle returned to his coach, lit a pipe, made himself comfortable, and went to sleep. Meanwhile, as preparations were being made to feed the Royalist soldiers, prayers and psalms could be heard coming from the opposing ranks. The time was around 7 in the evening. With thunder threatening more bad weather, the Parliamentarian and Scots forces advanced down the slight incline to attack the Royalists. The Royalist left wing was hit by a determined cavalry force led by Lord Fairfax's son, Sir Thomas Fairfax. They were struck by withering fire as they crossed the ditch, but succeeded in routing a number of Royalist units, pursuing them off the field in the direction of York. By the time Thomas Fairfax returned from the pursuit, he found his remaining Parliamentarian troops in trouble, his brother mortally wounded, and men fleeing the field. On the right, Cromwell's first line of horse passed the ditch after the Scots dragoons had driven off the musketeers positioned behind a hedge. The Royalist right-wing commander, Lord Byron, advanced to counter-attack with his horse, which was against his orders. Cromwell's Ironsides met Byron's men and drove them off the battlefield, although Cromwell was wounded in the arm. The sudden, successful attack by Cromwell had caused the Royalists to abandon the ditch and a number of artillery pieces that had been defending it. Repeated counter-attacks by Lord Byron failed to regain the position, and his men became disorganised. With the Royalist centre holding, Rupert decided to take his cavalry reserve, including the Life Guard, and counter-attack Cromwell's breakthrough on his right flank. Assailed on two sides, Cromwell's cavalry was pressed hard. One of his officers wrote, "They were charged by Rupert's bravest men, both in front and flank. They stood at the sword's point a pretty while, hacking one another, but at least it so pleased God, he, Cromwell, brake through them, scattering them before him like a little dust." With the aid of a number of Covenanter regiments, the Royalist wing was now routed, with Rupert forced to hide in a field of crops to evade capture. But elsewhere things were not going so well. Whilst Thomas Fairfax had routed part of the Royalist left flank, a good part of it had held on in good order, whereas the Parliamentary forces had become disordered as they chased those fleeing the field. They themselves were then attacked by fresh troops. The attack was a success, with much of the Parliamentarian wing put to flight. Those at the front caused panic as they fled through the other troops. Lord Fairfax, overall commander of the Parliamentarian right wing, joined his infantry as they left the field. Still in good order, the Royalist left wing now attacked the flank of the Parliamentarian centre. In all the confusion, Sir Thomas Fairfax threw away the white scarf by which many of the Parliamentarians distinguished themselves. Those were the days before regular uniforms, and he rode amid the turmoil right through the rampaging Royalist cavalry to reach Cromwell on the left flank. He found Cromwell and his men, who had regrouped near a wood, and informed him of the unfolding chaos on the Parliamentary right wing. The time was around 8:30 p.m, and there could only be another hour or so before the sun went down. Cromwell took his Ironsides and launched into the Royalist rear, freshly reorganised, well led and determined. Some 2,500 cavalry smashed into their lines. Newcastle's troops, the Whitecoats, held out longest in the centre, as many others fled back towards York. They kept their attackers at bay for over an hour, through repeated assaults. One contemporary stated, "They stood like wall, but they were mowed down like a meadow." Reputedly, only 30 were taken prisoner. The rest fell where they stood. The mopping up of the remaining Royalists continued into the night, as small pockets of resistance were driven or wiped from the field. The Marquess of Newcastle was forced to abandon his carriage in his flight back to York. Here he met with Prince Rupert. Dejected, Newcastle informed Rupert of his plan to go into exile in Europe. He had spent a fortune in support of Charles, and he would not endure the laughter of the court over the defeat. The Earl of Manchester's chaplain wrote of the field that night, "That night they kept the field, and the bodies of the dead were stripped. In the morning there was a mortifying object to behold, when the naked bodies of thousands lay upon the ground, and many not quite dead." The Royalists counted their dead in thousands. Of the 17,000 that took the field that day in support of King Charles, 4,000 were killed and another 1,500 captured. 2 days after the battle, Rupert would muster just 5,000 men when he departed from York to return south. For the Parliamentarians it was a decisive victory. They had lost perhaps around 300, and York had more or less been abandoned, and so too the north of England. Well, that is it for our 25th season of podcasts. Angus and I would once again like to thank you all for listening along the way, whether that's been as a recent finder of the podcast, or even if you've been here for the whole 12 years along with us. Thank you for your patronage. And going back to what I said at the beginning, if you do have time and feel the inclination, then please do go along to patreon.com/The History Network and just see what we're thinking of doing from next season onwards. There's a video of Angus and myself explaining it all. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Angus Wallace, read by Nick Barker.